this is not assisted dying. This is suicide. And in terms of Oregon, it's taken as long as 137 hours for the person to die. And that is just beyond barbaric. Mostly it was the suicide of a friend of mine when I was 18 that inspired me to really think about suicide. If I see a man teetering on a ledge and I can prevent him from jumping, I do so.
Kevin Yuill is an historian and author. He's also a lifelong humanist and a committed opponent of assisted suicide, chairing the Humanists Against Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia group. He joins me now. Kevin, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start, tell us a bit about yourself, your background and how you got involved in this fight and writing about assisted suicide.
Okay, I was a professional historian. I'm now a retired professional historian, what's called an emeritus professor, which means they don't pay me anymore. But I keep the title. Whoops, that's fortuitous. So yes, I have written on history. Some of the history that I wrote on actually does impact on this. But mostly it was the suicide of a friend of mine when I was 18 that inspired me to really think about suicide and whether that was a legitimate choice. And of course, when you're 18, all of these things go through your mind. Should we have not interfered? Should we have interfered? Should we have said, is it my fault? Is it somebody else's fault? Whose fault is it? And we mused about that for a long time, and it was only a friend of mine who I also worked with and who worked with his father who said it was a really wrong, awful thing for him to do. Look at what he's done to his family, and he utterly destroyed his family. It was just horrific. Yeah. And, it's something that affects us, I mean, to this day. And that inspired me to think critically about suicide. Does somebody have the right to take their own life? Or do we owe them some sort of protection, even against themselves at times? And so that inspired me. There was, I'm not sure whether you'd be familiar with Dr. Kevorkian in the US.
No.
All right. Well, he was Dr. Death, he was called. And he was one of the early pioneers of assisted suicide. And in fact, he was put in prison for euthanizing somebody live on television. He was a bit creepy. But that raised it all for me. And again, so I wrote my very first article in 1996 on it in the Tablet. And I have sort of been active on it. I've probably written 100 articles on it since then. Because the other thing, as a historian, you look back and you think, I'm investigating this racism in the 1920s. And I was thinking, where were the activists there? And I was thinking, what would I have done when there? Because it cried out for activism. It cried out for somebody to speak up and say something. And nobody did. And I thought, well, I can't stand around when I see something that I think is wrong going on. So I thought, I'm going to fight against it. And I've been doing that. And I do it pretty well. That's my only job now.
Excellent. But of course, you're a humanist. And the normative position of a humanist is usually to be for assisted suicide, or at least of the humanist organisations that we see. Why are you not on that bandwagon, and why are they not on yours?
Well, because I see, it depends on your type of humanism. So there's sort of destructive humanists who really hate everybody who's religious and resent any kind of religious ideas. I don't. I'm what you might call a Feuerbachian humanist. Feuerbach being a German philosopher from the 19th century, who used this very, very useful phrase, I thought, where he said, people say, religions say that God made man in his own image. I say man made God in his own image. So in some ways, God, the churches, the wonder you feel when you step into a cathedral and the awe and the reverence is something due to human beings. So that's our difference, is that what you attribute to God, I attribute to humanity. Now that means that humanity should be even more precious. We should be much more considerate about life than others. There's also a difference that comes from the period of time that is my sort of historical speciality, which is the early part of the 20th century. And what happens then is that you get a kind of materialist view of humanity. And it's like utilitarian, really. It sees humanity at, the greatest good for the greatest number. And so it wants to streamline humanity. So therefore, it goes in for eugenics. It goes in for compulsive sterilization of people that they've deemed unfit. It goes in for euthanasia. And so the humanist movement was very involved in that. Population concerned people all there's a big dovetailing of those groups. And I think they're anti-humanist and anti-human. So that's my perspective.
And if we then look at the assisted suicide fight in this country, you've got Lord Faulkner and Baroness Hayter and Kim Leadbeater and all of their ilk. And they say that the movement against assisted suicide is this secret movement of religious zealots. How would you combat that?
That is one of the most irritating things that I have to combat, because what they're doing is they're going after the man rather than the ball, so to speak. They are attacking the people saying it rather than actually addressing the arguments. I agree with huge numbers of people who are religious if they make a sensible argument. I disagree with arguments that they make opposed to that. But that's their sort of little, this is all funded by secretive groups and everything else like that. And having worked in this movement with religious groups, I can tell you they're not very well funded in general. And not only that, but Dignity in Dying, the major organization who is pushing for this, is well funded. And ultimately, they have all sorts of monies that come from various different places. I don't make a big deal of that because I think, well, you're entitled to make your arguments. I think you should be, and I'm not going to, question you about who pays you or whatever. I think it's relevant in some issues, but I really dislike the attack on religious people because it assumes that, religious people and myself can't share a sort of abhorrence of killing. And I think killing is wrong. And that's why I'm involved in this, and that's why most religious people are involved in it. You do not have to be religious to think that thou shalt not kill is not a bad rule.
Yeah. Do you get a lot of flack from other humanists for your position and for your organisation?
I've got flack. I've got threatened to be sued, and very serious threats to be sued. So, yeah, they're not happy with me taking this position. I used to have debates with people, and I'm still friendly-ish with Andrew Copson and people like that. But, it's really soured my kind of perspective. I've offered to write for their publications and say, well, there's another case. Here's the humanist case against assisted suicide. They have refused. But I have written for the other humanist magazine, which I can't think of the name of, but they were very good. But the humanists who wrote in were very upset that I had even made these arguments. And we carried on letters for a few times. I don't back down, though, so I don't mind.
Do you think that humanism is just a cover, then, for anti-religion among some humanists?
Among some humanists. I think most of them are fairly honest and they believe what they believe. And they do, on some issues. Like, for instance, being a historian of the United States, I like the separation of state and religion. I think that's not a bad idea. And my wife used to teach in schools, and I used to say, you teach religion, why would you teach that? That's, for parents to inculcate their children if they want to, or, not if they want to. And it was so, and then I saw the sort of content, it's so weedy that you thought, who cares about whether but I just thought, this is silly. I don't think there should be schools that are specifically. So what I'm trying to say is I stand with humanists on some questions, but certainly not on the assisted suicide question and, or the euthanasia question.
Mm. So we've been talking about assisted suicide, but the elephant in the room is a lot of the anti-assisted suicide lobby are from general pro-life groups, anti-abortion groups. you aren't anti-abortion. How do you square that circle? And how have you found working with the pro-lifers?
Well, at first I was worried. In fact, because I had marched for abortion rights in the 1980s and 90s, and so I knew the name was SPUC, for instance. But it was, and it took me a little while to get used to that. But then, I met people like Alethea, and I thought, well, all we're going to do is we're going to talk about assisted suicide. And one of the rules that I have for my group is please don't mention abortion at the same time as assisted suicide, because that's one of the problems, is that the anti-religious humanists will sit there and say, see, it's all a big circle there. They oppose, and I like to complicate that picture. I think it's useful to have somebody who has different views. I think, people on my side run from, for instance, the Communist Party, I've written for them, right through to very, very sort of conservative religious groups. So I work with everybody there. During the last debate, it was Danny Kruger and Naz Shah, and you thought two more unlikely political bedfellows you could never find, but they work very well together, and that's my idea, is I work with anybody who is opposed to assisted suicide. On the question of abortion, my position really is twofold. First of all, I think that it's a political question for me. So it's not our bodies ourselves. I don't believe that. I don't think demanding for somebody else to do an operation on you is a sort of autonomy question, just like I don't think that demanding that society provides assisted suicide is an autonomy question. However, I do think that women cannot be entirely equal until they have the right to control their fertility. So I hate abortion because I love human beings and I want fewer abortions in general. But I do think as a last resort, it should be available to women. I would dissuade any woman that I knew from having an abortion, but in the end, I think it has to be her decision, and she has to make it for whatever reason she wants to make it. So that's on the first hand. The second hand is, I don't think that you can regard a fetus as a human being. I think that is almost just as diminishing of a human being as saying that somebody at the end of life should not be regarded as a human being. A fetus does not have any relationship outside of its mother. So that's its world. When it comes out and it's independent and can live independently of the mother, I think that's a useful place to actually think this is a human being and this human being deserves our protection. But then, with the religious position, I think you run into the difficulty of where does this start? Conception is all, contraception, verboten, so those are my two objections. I'm not entirely opposed to arguments, up for people who are opposed to abortion. And sometimes I'm swayed one direction or the other, but I still, there are exceptions, of course, to the assisted suicide rule. I'm opposed to the legalization of assisted suicide. I'm not going to condemn individuals, and nor will, if an assisted suicide clinic opens up, I wouldn't be camping out and say, you are sinning, you are terrible, this is bad. I would think this is very sad, but I think the real problem for society is when morality, our moral rules, are shifted to actually allow killing. And I think that's the real problem. But feel free to ask me further questions.
Yeah, no, I think we'll probably stay on assisted suicide just for our time constraints.
Right.
But as you mentioned, assisted suicide there, with the Westminster Bill, what do you think the prognosis is?
Well, it's very difficult to say because there are several bills throughout the United Kingdom and its dependencies. So we go from day to day, basically, in our little group that I organize, which is the campaigns group that used to be the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group up on Dying Well, but is now really just a campaigns group. And, there are several situations. First of all, Isle of Man has passed it. I think the very worst place is probably Jersey. I think it will actually go through in Jersey. Isle of Man, the Ministry of Justice has just objected to various aspects of the Jersey bill, which is fascinating simply because it is David Lammy who has the power to give or to refuse royal assent. You'd think it'd be a royal, but no, it's not. It's David Lammy. And so they are in an impasse at the moment with their legislation. But the objections that Ministry of Justice make apply to the English bill. So I think the prognosis is best in Westminster. I don't think that it will go through. I think it will fail. Not, I would hasten to add, because of filibustering, which, as a historian, I hate that term because, of course, they don't know what filibustering is. Filibustering is not asking pertinent questions about a very shaky piece of legislation that people are trying to ram through. Filibustering is what the segregationist Strom Thurmond did in 1957 when he talked for 24 hours and 18 minutes to try and talk out the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 and failed at doing it. But that is filibustering. That's when you're reading out books or hymns or whatever. He read verses of the Bible and various different things. And that record stood for 68 years. So it's a long filibuster. Speaking for 4 to 10 minutes is not filibustering, and it very much annoys me when it's labelled as such.
Do we know what those objections from the Isle of Man bill are and how they would match the Westminster one?
A lot of them have to do with the coroner, with the pre and after arrangement. So, for instance, in England and Wales, when you have what's called an unusual death or a suspicious death, something that occurs that's not natural, then you have a coroner's report. Otherwise, you have the medical examiner is in charge of deaths that aren't. So Dignity and Dying and their ilk are very interested in stopping it from being seen as suicide or anything different. So they have removed the coroner from the whole question. The Ministry of Justice is not happy about that, or about the record taking that, for instance, might be talking about the underlying disease rather than what it is, which is suicide. When you ingest deadly poison with the intent to die, guess what? That's suicide. That's not assisted dying, or that's not any of the nice little phrases that they use. So in terms of the prognosis, Scotland is on the knife edge. That's the one I'm worried about. We shall see what happens in Scotland. And I go from day to day from up to down. I never know exactly what is happening there. I could have predicted, I did predict that Liam MacArthur would be very happy with 6 months to live because he'd know he's going to roll that back. It's been rolled back in every other country where it's been initiated outside of Switzerland and the United States. So the 6 months to live is gone. And of course Liam MacArthur would say, yeah, okay, 6 months to live. And then it passes, gets over the line. And, do these campaigners dust their hands and go home? Or do they start campaigning to broaden it immediately? And we both know that it's the latter. So Scotland is problematic. I think Westminster, but many things, there's Wales as well. Now there's what's called a
Legislative Consent Motion.
LCM, that's the one. Yes, Legislative Consent Motion, which is coming up on the 24th. Now, if that fails, they're in big trouble because that means I think if it fails, it's much worse for them than if it passes. It is for us because if it passes, it will be moot if the Westminster legislation fails. So I think it's there's all to play for. Put it this way. I always think I'm going to retire and I'm going to do something else. And there's just no time and no opportunity. We have to keep on with this and it's important. So,
but that Welsh motion, it's interesting. So 24th of February, they're doing that. Am I correct in that if the Senedd do not vote for it, assisted suicide will be legal in Wales but not provided on the Welsh National Health Service?
Yes, it will be. Then it will. Yes, if it will not be provided, it will have to be provided by private companies, or they will have to shift people to England, which they don't really want to do. I think it's very complicated, and I get these things wrong, so you'd have to check that. But I believe that if it falls, yes, then it's Westminster that is. If it fails and then it passes in Westminster, it means that it's unlikely they will have no control. The Senedd will have no control over it. So it's exactly opposite of what most people think it is. And I am worried because we have some very good MSs there who are worried about their colleagues misinterpreting this. It's always the thing dealing with politicians is to think they're not stupid people, but they're people whose attentions go from here to here to here to here to here. They need very short, pithy little arguments. They can't be dealing with pages and pages. I was shocked at how few of the MPs had actually read Kim's bill themselves. It's amazing. Where you just think, you don't even know this bill, and yet you're voting for it. But she gave people 2 weeks, and that was not, of course, adequate. The Lords is got longer time, and lo and behold, they're actually doing their job.
Now, a lot of the debate around assisted suicide, it promotes it as this idea of choice, this utopian idea that when someone is done with their life, they can have this painless and quick and easy death. And you mentioned other jurisdictions earlier when talking about Liam MacArthur. Do you have any horror stories of when the injection of this poison is not a nice and easy death, but is in fact something far worse?
Well, I mean, yes, there are many examples of that. Never forget that the same drugs as are used in executions in the United States are used for euthanasia. And euthanasia is much more efficient than is assisted suicide. So when you look into the Oregon reports, one of the things that one of the drugs that is administered actually just freezes the patient's ability to express themselves. So if they felt pain, you would not know it. So it appears very serene, and on the outside, it may not be. It's a paralytic. I can't remember. I'm not an expert on the drugs, but it paralyzes the patient basically, and then the death tends to be that they drown in their own fluid in their lungs. And in terms of Oregon, it's taken as long as 137 hours for the person to die. And that is just beyond barbaric. So I think people who say, oh, this will be a good death are not absolutely certain that it will be. I mean, in the United States, there are Amnesty International protests the fact that somebody's taken 15 minutes to die. But the average is under an hour for Oregon. And there's no protest about that. And I think, well, why not? This is obviously cruel.
So I suppose to end up, the note would be, and I always remember it's one of the best bits of the debate in the House of Lords I've seen, was Baroness May standing up and saying, suicide is wrong. Is that the message that you will endorse at the end of this interview?
Yes. I mean, the two parts of this that I've been pushing for such a long time is this is not assisted dying. This is suicide. And anybody who pretends that it's assisted dying is fooling not only you, but themselves often. It is suicide. Society has an interest in preventing suicide because one of the very fundamental aspects of society is we protect each other. If I saw you being attacked, I would like to think that I would go and stop somebody from attacking you. If I saw somebody about to fall into a ravine and hurt themselves, I would like to think that I'd stop them. That is a really basic essence of our humanity. If I see a man teetering on a ledge and I can prevent him from jumping, I do so. That is part of our humanity. And this radically changes that. This, if you see the man teetering on the bridge, is either going down to the bottom and yelling jump and encouraging him, which is barbaric in my view, or offering him a push, which is barbaric as well. And I think when you understand it in such stark terms, it's very difficult to say that assisted suicide is a good thing.
But it's interesting you talk about the difference between assisted dying and assisted suicide and the way it's packaged. I remember I was talking to Lord Moylan, who's an excellently eloquent man, and he was saying that it's euphemism, and the idea of euphemism was always this idea that the Greeks would hide things from the gods that they don't want to know. Do you think the assisted suicide lobby is embarrassed about the reality of what they are pushing?
Yes, and this is why I push this idea, is because it is something that they can't even countenance. Because most of them would probably stop somebody teetering on the bridge. And what they can't recognize is that poisoning yourself with the intent to die is no less suicide than jumping off a cliff or shooting yourself in the head or hanging yourself. It doesn't matter. And they tell people, well, and to be fair to them, what they do is they say, well, there are situations where it's probably better for somebody to die right at the end of life. And I accept that. I think that, I've witnessed enough deaths that one of them, my grandmother could have done with a week less of her life. I think, she died of emphysema, and it was just, and she didn't want to live anymore. Now, of course, that thinking, being relieved when somebody dies is different than killing them. And that's the big moral difference, the distinction. So I think what they want to tell themselves is we're just helping people in that invidious, awful situation at the end of life. And I say, well, if it's that terrible, go ahead and help them. But, it's not the occasional act that bothers me. It's changing the moral rules to accept some types of suicide as legitimate. And that's the real problem, I think, at the very basis of this whole thing.
So as we close up, just 30 seconds, what should the people watching this interview do now?
Well, first of all, they should write to their MPs and say, how can you let your colleagues get away with this? They have sent this bill to be, examined and really scrutinized in the Lords. And now they're saying, well, no, that's no good. And it's a little bit like, if you follow football, it's a bit going at halftime and looking at the result and going, we're not doing well. Let's change VAR. Let's get rid of VAR. Campaign to get rid of VAR at halftime. It's just not on. And so Simon Ofer, who is chair of the APPG designed to reform the Lords, made a huge statement. I've just seen it, a copy of it. I made a huge statement 6 months ago saying the Lords must look at these questions, the Lords must examine this, and we shouldn't let them ram it through. And that's the message I would say. Get to, write to Lords and thank them, or write to Lords and disagree with them. Write to your political representatives. They actually read these things, is what you learn. They are actually human beings who accept things, and I think make your strength of feeling known.
Excellent. Kevin Yuill, thank you very much for coming on SPUCTV.
Well, thank you very much for having me.